Sex is an incredibly interesting phenomenon in and of itself. Think about it. An individual from a species deposits a bodily fluid into another individual's body opening. When these fluids mix, they trigger a very special chemical reaction. The molecular system that forms as a result of this reaction, a zygote, goes through an unbelievable series of divisions. After a certain amount of time, it becomes a brand new individual of that species. And living things have been doing this non-stop for hundreds of millions of years. So much so that, as I've mentioned before, a single break in this reproductive line means that the hundreds of thousands of individuals that would have stemmed from that line might never exist. Consider this. If each individual has an average of 2 offspring, and just one of your ancestors 20 generations ago had been unable to reproduce, then more than 2 million descendants, including you, would never have come into existence. Despite reproduction being such a fundamental concept, it's barely taught in our schools and rarely discussed in everyday life. So when we, as a science page, introduce the penis or vagina, people react as if they themselves spontaneously appeared out of thin air. And yet, it's interesting that the most read articles and the most watched videos on evolution tree are the ones about sex. I'll leave the sociological discussion of that to you for now, but today I'll be addressing a few of the most common questions I receive. Why are there different sexes, each with distinct traits? Why and how did sex evolve? And generally, why do we see only 2 biological sexes in most species? If you're ready, let's begin. First of all, let's make one thing very clear. It's easy to overlook this. Sexes and sex did not first evolve in humans. All of the 8.7 million eukaryotic species alive today, and the hundreds of millions of eukaryotic species that have ever lived and gone extinct, share 2 basic traits. They have complex cells with membrane-bound organelles. They reproduce sexually, or more precisely, they have some form of sexual reproduction. Hence, sexes, and the interactions that lead to sex, began evolving approximately 1 to 1.5 billion years ago, and were then passed down to all descendant species. We humans are simply one of those descendant lines. To understand sex, we first need to understand how biological sexes evolved. But to grasp that, we need to look at how microscopic gametes, such as sperm and eggs, are formed. In other words, we need to understand meiosis. I'm not going to delve into the steps of mitosis and meiosis and turn this into a high school biology lesson. Anyone interested can read about those on our website. But when we look across all life forms, we see 3 main types of reproduction. The simplest organisms, like bacteria, reproduce by a very simple form of cell division called mitosis, which is somewhat analogous to how a soap bubble splits into 2. We talked about this in our video on bees' hexagonal honeycombs. Everything, living or non-living, tends to maximize the ratio of surface area to volume or to minimize potential energy. Slightly more complex organisms use mitosis, which still involves splitting into 2 but in a far more orderly, chromosome-based process. Mitosis is the type of division that allows you to grow from a single cell, the zygote, into the massive organism you are. Finally, in organisms that reproduce sexually, there is a process similar to mitosis but performed twice in a row, cutting the chromosome number in half. This process is called meiosis. In chronological terms, we see a gradual evolution of these cell division strategies. Of course, there are other types of reproduction, but those are topics for other videos. Make sure to enable channel notifications if you don't want to miss them. For today's topic, sex, it's meiosis that really matters. In humans, for example, meiosis reduces 46 chromosomes down to 23. These 23 chromosome cells, known as gametes, eggs or sperm, unite during fertilization, which is the crux of sex. A sperm and an egg fuse together, forming a 46 chromosome zygote. Through trillions of subsequent mitotic divisions, and the reading and expression of genetic information carried in those chromosomes, which have accumulated mutations over billions of years, a specific life form is built from that zygote. In doing so, a new individual of the species is created. If you alter that chromosomal information, you get organisms that look different. Indeed, some of the diversity mechanisms in evolution come into play at this very stage. though I won't dive too deeply into that here. We know meiosis today as a mechanism in our body's reproductive tissues for producing half-chromosome, haploid, sperm and egg cells. But in ancient times, meiosis didn't evolve for that purpose. Meiosis initially evolved as a defense mechanism. Why a defense mechanism? If you touch another person, no matter how long you hold contact, you won't just fuse with them, right? Your skin structure prevents that. But if you take two single-celled organisms and place them side by side, it's possible, though not guaranteed, that they can fuse together over time. Likewise, during amitosis or even mitosis, improper separation can sometimes occur, causing the daughter cells to fuse back together. As a result, the two offspring cells could remain stuck together like conjoined twins. In most cases, that's disastrous for the offspring cells. They end up as a single organism with double the normal number of chromosomes, potentially producing twice as many proteins, disrupting gene networks, and often leading to the cell's death. Quick aside, I always like to stress that often is not always. In the animal kingdom, especially in plants, genome duplication, i.e. multiplying chromosome sets by 2, 4, 8, 16, etc., is actually quite common and can spawn brand new diversity. Also, cell fusion doesn't always lead to bad outcomes. For instance, the mitochondria powering your cells and the chloroplasts that produce nutrients in plants were once free-living prokaryotes that became permanently fused inside larger cells, according to the endosymbiotic theory, giving rise to our modern complex eukaryotic cells. All of those topics are for other videos, though. You know what to do if you don't want to miss them. So basically, meiosis evolved as a defense mechanism to reduce the chromosome count back to normal when unwanted fusion occurred. Imagine if two of your 46 chromosome cells fused into one 92 chromosome cell, likely causing a problem. If that 92 chromosome cell undergoes meiosis, it effectively performs a double mitosis-like division and reduces the chromosome number back to 46. You'd end up with 4 cells instead of 2, but each would have the correct 46 chromosomes. However, once meiosis evolved, it didn't spread so widely just because it was a handy defense mechanism. It had capabilities that mitosis did not. Yes, mitosis is fast, uses little energy, and simply produces identical copies of the parent cell. In most cases, these are all beneficial features. But consider a population in which every individual is a near-perfect copy of every other. If a virus or bacterium emerges that targets that specific set of traits, what do you think would happen? For instance, imagine if we all had precisely the same traits as someone susceptible to SARS-CoV-2. A single outbreak could wipe us out in a matter of months. Genetic diversity is vital for adapting to changing conditions. While mutations do occur during mitosis, increasing diversity to some extent, that hardly compares to what's possible with meiosis. Recombination, known in high school textbooks as crossing over, became a new evolutionary mechanism thanks solely to the existence of meiosis. Different chromosomes in the same individual could now be shuffled to create entirely new combinations. Every time an organism produces sperm or eggs, it can potentially generate a brand new variant of itself. So, although meiosis is slower and more costly, the explosion in diversity it introduced was so advantageous that it drove a massive evolutionary expansion. That's partly why prokaryotes, which mostly rely on simpler forms of reproduction, are more uniform, while eukaryotic life is extraordinarily diverse. It's not just gene shuffling inside the cell either. By slicing the chromosome count in half, meiosis created haploid cells. In the beginning, that actually worked against the original defense purpose, because instead of chopping down an incorrect chromosome count, it was having the correct one. But as long as enough individuals were present, haploid cells began fusing with each other, restoring the original chromosome number. And that's when sexual reproduction truly took off. No longer were organisms making exact copies of themselves. Their specialized haploid cells fused together to form new combinations, turbocharging the diversity even further, which was incredibly beneficial for spreading into new habitats and niches and assuming new forms. So then, why have sexes at all? Couldn't there just be one big universal sex that self-fertilized? Technically, yes. But as you've gathered from what I've said so far, diversity is almost universally advantageous in evolution, so long as conditions favor it. Having more than one sex means producing individuals with different traits, which was strongly selected for. But it's more complicated than that. The evolution of sex involved an intense arms race, so fasten your seatbelts. There are several evolutionary models explaining the evolution of sexes, but the one that interests me the most is the Hurst-Hamilton hypothesis. It addresses the question, if meiosis is so widespread in eukaryotes, why didn't it evolve in prokaryotes, bacteria, the same way? This hypothesis suggests that the difference lies in organelles like mitochondria or chloroplasts, some of the hallmarks that separate eukaryotes from prokaryotes. Remember, organelles are specialized structures inside cells. When a eukaryotic cell forms a gamete, it doesn't just pass on half of its nuclear chromosomes, it also passes on a portion of its organelles to that gamete. But these organelles, such as mitochondria and chloroplasts, used to be free-living cells, meaning they have their own DNA. That's still the case today. In each of your cells, there's a nuclear genome plus a separate mitochondrial genome. If you were a plant, you'd have chloroplast genes as well. They're basically organisms within an organism. There's no problem in splitting nuclear chromosomes equally between gametes. Each parent contributes, say, 23 chromosomes in humans. But because cells can vary in size, shape, and developmental stage, the number of organelles they carry into their gametes can differ. One parent may contribute many more organelles than the other, and that discrepancy sets up genetic conflict. The gamete contributing fewer organelles is at a disadvantage, driving selection in the population for organelle-destroying genes and proteins, giving those gametes an upper hand. Imagine a mutation that allows your gamete to destroy the other gamete's organelles. That's a huge advantage if your organelle genes get propagated at a higher rate. These organelle genes are crucial for survival and disease resistance, so being the one who destroys the other's organelles can be highly favorable. But as that destructive mutation spreads, gametes equipped with it start encountering each other more often, effectively wiping out the organelles from both sides, lethal for any resulting offspring. Now, you have an arms race. Variants that can suppress these destructive genes become favored. But any gene that suppresses another's destructive capacity also suppresses its own ability to destroy. This leads to a dynamic known throughout evolutionary biology as heterozygote advantage. If both parents carry destructive genes, the resulting zygote lacks organelles entirely and dies. If both have suppressor genes, they're somewhat better off, but having two copies of these suppressor genes can be costly with no extra benefit, an evolutionary trade-off. But one destructive parent plus one suppressor parent, i.e., a heterozygote, yields the best survival strategy and dominates the population. This is how, starting with just one type of gamete, you could get two types via a simple genetic conflict. Destroyers became what we call sperm, and suppressors became eggs. For instance, the universal observation that mitochondria are usually inherited only from the mother, or that sperm cells exhibit traits that can suppress the effectiveness of other sperm, perfectly aligns with this model's predictions. So why don't eggs always fuse with eggs, or sperm with sperm? This is where a third group of genes, the selector genes, comes into play. Usually activated by protein signals that gametes release into the environment, these genes let gametes recognize each other, repel similar gametes, and fuse with those that are different. Selector genes come with a cost, sure. But as with any trade-off, if the benefit of matching the right gametes is high enough, and in this case it's crucial for survival, these genes will be favored in the population. If these suppressor genes and selector genes happen to be close together on the chromosome, they're more likely to remain linked during meiosis and be co-selected, further cementing their advantage. This genetic arms race neatly explains how two distinct gamete types might have evolved. Once that original split occurred, each gamete type began accumulating unique traits. One gamete, for instance, grew larger and provided more nourishment for the future embryo. This is costly, but it passes on more organelles and even offers the organism-level advantage of being more selective about mating partners. In biology, the party that produces these large, resource-heavy gametes is called the female. The other gamete type is much smaller and can be produced in large numbers. We call the organisms that produce these smaller, cheaper gametes males. Another note, up to this point I've been talking purely in terms of biological definitions of sex. How this translates to human societies and concepts like gender is a completely separate issue. In the higher levels of the explanatory hierarchy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, these terms can transform in entirely different ways. Remember, at the fundamental level, almost everything is rooted in quantum physics, but in our daily lives we don't really perceive that. Similarly, we can't just jump from a purely biological definition to sweeping sociological or psychological statements. So be cautious. Anyway, you can see how elegantly this model explains the evolution of sexes. But you might still ask, why only two? Why not 50,000 different biological sexes? Actually, there are species with thousands of sexes, particularly in the fungal kingdom. For example, Physarum polycephalum has 720 sexes. Schizophrylum commune has 28,000. Tetrahymena thermophila has 7. Certain ants in the genus Pogonomyrmex have 3 or 4 sexes, and some clam shrimp, order Spinacaudata, also have 3. But these are exceptions. In these unusual populations, having many sexes produces what we call a metastable balance, not as stable as having just 2 sexes. This multi-sex scenario hugely boosts reproductive potential, but it also accelerates the spread of harmful mutations in mitochondrial or chloroplast DNA, harming the species overall. Mathematically, and from what we see in nature, having 2 sexes appears to be the most evolutionarily stable system. We can go deeper into the details in another video if you'd like. Let me know in the comments if you're interested. Also recall what I explained in the Why Don't Animals Have Wheels or Humans with Wings video. There might indeed be some more uber solution out there, but if it's extremely difficult to reach evolutionarily, organisms will stick to the simpler solution for as long as it works. Once you grasp the evolutionary basis of sexual reproduction, understanding sexual organs and the evolution of sex as we know it becomes much simpler. Penises and vaginas, for example, emerged back when animals were evolving in the oceans, and they served a single purpose: to increase the likelihood that sperm and eggs would actually encounter each other in the chaos of ocean life. Early ancestors that spawned externally would deposit their sperm and eggs in external nooks or crevices and hope they would meet, which did work but was highly inefficient. Consequently, internal fertilization evolved. Animals began clinging to each other tightly and directly transferring sperm to the egg-containing channel. Eventually, the penis and vagina evolved into a hook and loop mechanism. The penis, shaped somewhat like a hook, and the vagina, shaped like a loop, secured the two parents together to prevent them from drifting apart, thus boosting the chances that sperm and egg would successfully unite. Later, these organs diverged into the dizzying array we see today. In some species, advanced methods of pairwise internal fertilization led to additional, sometimes bizarre evolutionary strategies to select the most viable offspring, such as the mechanisms underlying menstruation in human females. You can watch our video on why women menstruate for an example of that. We've been focusing on animals so far, but plants usually remain in the background. Pollination and flowering structures function similarly, except they evolved to solve the mating hurdles of sessile organisms that can't simply move around. We'll cover pollen and floral adaptations in another video. So there you have it. Even in a discussion this thorough, I've had to skip many details. For instance, there are other models for how sexes might have evolved. Some focus on harmful mutation removal or ecological challenges like parasites. There are also models exploring why sexual reproduction is so non-negotiable in many eukaryotes, like metazoans, but much more flexible in plants. I chose this model because by simply repeating the destroyer-suppressor-selector gene cycle 2 or 3 times, you can get increasingly specialized gametes. That single mechanism can produce very specialized gamete types, which I believe aligns beautifully with what we observe in nature. I also didn't cover the intermediate steps in the evolution from mitosis to meiosis. There's something called paramitosis, for instance, which could be a transitional phase. I'll include a link below to one of our articles if you want to learn more about the possible stages bridging these two reproductive methods. In conclusion, I hope this video has helped you discover aspects of how sex has evolved that you've never heard before, and shown you just how intricate and profound evolutionary biology can get. If it serves as a starting point for you into the mind-blowing world of sexes and sex, then all the better. See you in the next video. Take care.